For the third time in a single week, American warplanes and missiles struck Iranian territory overnight. This time, the trigger wasn't a warning shot or a skirmish near the coastline. It was a direct attack on a commercial container ship flying the flag of Cyprus, quietly transiting the Strait of Hormuz, one of the busiest and most economically critical waterways on the planet. According to U.S. Central Command, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces blatantly attacked that vessel, and as of the latest reporting, one crew member remains missing. Hours later, Iran didn't just claim responsibility, it went further, declaring the entire Strait of Hormuz closed to all shipping. In response, the United States launched its third wave of strikes in 7 days, hitting approximately 140 Iranian military targets overnight. Across just 3 nights this week, CENTCOM says it has now struck more than 300 targets total. And within hours of that third strike, Iran fired back, not at the American homeland, but at U.S. military infrastructure spread across Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar simultaneously. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened on this Cyprus-flagged ship, whether the Strait of Hormuz is actually closed the way Iran claims, what the U.S. hit in this third strike wave, and why the world's most important energy corridor is once again at the center of a rapidly spiraling crisis. Stay to the end, because there's a genuine dispute right now between Iran and the United States over a basic, verifiable fact, whether ships can even move through this waterway, and understanding who's telling the truth matters for anyone watching oil prices, shipping insurance, or the broader trajectory of this war. Let's start with what actually happened to trigger this third round of strikes. According to U.S. Central Command, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship as it was transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC's own justification for the attack was that the vessel had allegedly crossed the strait using what it called an unauthorized route, a claim that has not been independently verified. One crew member from that ship remains missing as of the latest reporting. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Iran's Revolutionary Guard separately claimed it had targeted and stopped a second vessel it described as an offending ship, warning that continued American and Israeli aggression, in its words, would lead to even more devastating responses. Iranian state broadcaster IRIB reported hearing explosions in Bandar Abbas and in the town of Sirik, both of which sit directly along the Iranian coastline facing the strait, suggesting the fighting in this specific corridor was intensifying on both sides simultaneously. Now here's where the story gets genuinely contested, and it's worth slowing down on this because you'll see very different claims depending on which source you're reading. Following this exchange of attacks, Iran declared that it was closing the Strait of Hormuz completely, stating no vessels would be permitted to transit. That's a massive claim. This single waterway carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply on any given day. A genuine, sustained closure would represent one of the most significant disruptions to global energy markets in decades. But U.S. Central Command has directly disputed that claim. According to CENTCOM's own public statements, the strait remains open, and commercial vessel transits through what it called the Vital International Maritime Corridor are continuing. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Organization, UKMTO, which independently monitors shipping conditions in the region, backed up the American position, stating that despite Iran's claim that the waterway was closed, the southern shipping route through the strait remains available and has actually been expanded to support two-way vessel traffic. According to figures released by the U.S. military, American forces have facilitated the passage of more than 800 ships and over 400 million barrels of crude oil through the strait over the past 2 months alone, with more than 140 ships passing through the waterway in just the past 7 days. So to be clear about where the facts actually stand right now, Iran is publicly claiming the strait is closed. The United States, backed by independent maritime monitoring from UKMTO, says it remains open, with traffic actively flowing and even expanding. Both of those claims are being made loudly and publicly. Only one of them can be fully true, and right now the independently verified shipping data appears to support the American position more than Iran's. Let's move to the American military response itself, because this wasn't a small symbolic strike. U.S. Central Command confirmed it had completed its third round of strikes against Iran this week, hitting approximately 140 Iranian military targets overnight. According to CENTCOM, the targets in this specific wave included Iranian missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance infrastructure. Zoom out, and the scale of this week's cumulative American campaign becomes even clearer. CENTCOM stated plainly that during 3 nights of strikes this week, it has now struck more than 300 targets total, all aimed, in the command's own words, at degrading Iran's ability to freely attack civilian mariners and commercial vessels transiting the strait. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth summed up the American posture in blunt terms on social media following the Saturday night strikes, stating simply that Iran made a poor choice, and now they pay. That's about as direct as official American military messaging gets, and it reflects just how aggressively Washington has chosen to respond to what it frames as a sustained Iranian campaign against international shipping, rather than a single isolated incident. Let's talk about how Iran responded to this third wave of strikes, because this is where the crisis expanded well beyond Iran's own borders. Iran's army claimed it carried out multiple waves of drone attacks targeting American military facilities across at least 2 Gulf states. According to a statement carried by Iran's state broadcaster IRIB, Iranian forces used explosive drones to strike a Patriot air defense system, an ammunition depot, and a radar facility linked to American forces inside Kuwait. A separate wave, according to the same Iranian statement, targeted a U.S. communication system and a radar site inside Bahrain. Iran framed all of these strikes as a direct response to what it described as ongoing American attacks on areas in southern Iran. On top of Kuwait and Bahrain, Iran's Revolutionary Guard also claimed it launched what it called retaliatory strikes against Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan, according to Iranian state media. That brought the total number of countries drawn into this specific retaliatory wave to at least 3: Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, all nations hosting American military infrastructure, but none of them direct combatants in the underlying U.S.-Iran dispute. The response from Gulf governments came almost immediately. It was significant. Kuwait's armed forces confirmed early Sunday that its military was actively intercepting what it described as hostile aerial targets within the country's airspace. Kuwaiti officials specifically told the public that any sounds of explosions they heard were the result of air defense systems intercepting incoming attacks, urging residents to follow instructions from relevant authorities, though the military did not specify exactly where those attacks originated from. In Qatar, the country's Ministry of Defense confirmed it had intercepted a missile attack targeting the country directly. Qatari officials went further diplomatically, stating that the country reserves the right to respond to these attacks, while simultaneously calling for an immediate and complete halt to military escalation across the region, a notable balancing act between asserting Qatar's own security rights and pushing for de-escalation at the same time. Qatari officials went further diplomatically, stating that the country reserves the right to respond to these attacks, while simultaneously calling for an immediate and complete halt to military escalation across the region, a notable balancing act between asserting Qatar's own security rights and pushing for de-escalation at the same time. The United Arab Emirates also reported intercepting incoming missile attacks during this same window, adding a 4th Gulf nation to the list of countries actively engaged in defending against Iranian strikes tied to this specific escalation, alongside Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. There's an almost bitterly ironic diplomatic detail buried inside this timeline that's worth highlighting because it captures just how fast this situation deteriorated. On Saturday, Iran had just wrapped up direct talks with Oman specifically focused on how to manage and stabilize traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with his Omani counterpart, and according to a source who spoke with CNN, Oman had drafted a tentative proposal outlining how routes through the strait could be managed cooperatively going forward, an attempt at exactly the kind of diplomatic off-ramp that could have prevented further escalation. Less than 24 hours later on Sunday, Oman's own state news agency reported that Iranian drones had struck sites inside Omani territory. In other words, within a single day of hosting talks aimed at de-escalating the exact crisis unfolding in the strait, Oman itself became a target. That detail alone tells you how quickly diplomatic momentum can evaporate in this conflict, and how difficult it's becoming for regional mediators to stay above the fray entirely, even when they're actively trying to broker a solution. The international condemnation that followed was swift and came from multiple directions simultaneously. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry issued a formal statement condemning what it called Iran's destabilizing behavior and its repeated attacks across the region. The Saudi statement went further, accusing Tehran of violating international law, the United Nations Charter, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Charter, and basic principles of good neighborliness, specifically citing attacks on commercial vessels that threaten maritime security and freedom of navigation. The Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council also issued a strong condemnation, describing Iran's continued actions as a direct threat to regional security and stability. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres personally urged both the United States and Iran to halt what he described as this renewed outbreak of fighting in the Middle East and return to negotiations. Through his spokesman, Stefan Dujarric, Guterres specifically referenced both the American attacks on Iran and Iran's own strikes on commercial vessels and Gulf allies, delivering a blunt, direct message. These attacks must stop. Even Pakistan weighed in diplomatically, with Deputy Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar posting on social media that regional mediators, specifically Pakistan and Oman, were urging both sides to return to diplomacy rather than continued military escalation. Let's zoom out and put this third strike wave into the context of the entire week, because the pace of escalation here has been genuinely extraordinary. This latest round of strikes actually began on Wednesday, according to reporting, meaning the United States and Iran have now been trading direct military strikes for 3 consecutive nights across a single week, following President Trump's declaration just days earlier that the ceasefire between the two countries was, in his words, over. That means in a single 7-day window, you have an initial round of American strikes following the original tanker attacks, a second larger wave targeting roughly 90 Iranian military sites, and now this third wave of approximately 140 targets following the container ship attack, and Iran's disputed claim to have shut the strait entirely. 3 separate rounds, more than 300 combined targets, and a fast-expanding web of retaliatory strikes now touching at least 5 Gulf and regional states: Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman, alongside Iran itself. It's worth pausing here to think about why Iran would publicly claim the strait is closed if independent monitoring organizations like UKMTO and the US military are both saying traffic continues to flow and is even expanding through the southern route. There are a few possible explanations, and honest reporting means laying them out rather than picking the most dramatic one. It's possible Iran genuinely attempted to physically block or heavily restrict traffic through IRGC naval patrols and the attacks on the Cyprus-flagged and second vessel, but simply lacks the sustained military capacity to enforce a full closure against the presence of American naval forces actively working to keep the corridor open. It's also possible the closure declaration is primarily a political and economic pressure tactic, designed to spike global oil prices and rattle markets regardless of whether Iran can physically enforce it on the water. Both of those explanations are plausible, and neither requires assuming bad faith from every source involved. What we can say with confidence, based on UKMTO's independent monitoring and the US military's own transit figures, over 800 ships and 400 million barrels moved through the strait in the past 2 months alone, is that, as of this recording, the strait has not been verifiably shut down in the way Iran's public statements claim. There's also a maritime security threat level worth mentioning, because it adds important nuance to this open versus closed debate. UKMTO has classified the maritime security threat level in the Strait of Hormuz as severe, even while confirming that transit routes remain physically available. That's an important distinction. Severe threat level doesn't mean the waterway is closed. It means ships transiting the corridor are doing so under a significantly elevated risk of attack, exactly the kind of environment where an incident like the Cyprus-flagged container ship being disabled becomes more likely, not less. So the more accurate picture isn't strait open versus strait closed as a simple binary. It's a strait that remains physically passable, with commercial traffic still moving in real volume, but under conditions of severe and rising risk, where every transiting vessel is now operating inside an active war zone rather than a normal, stable shipping lane. Let's talk about what this means going forward, because the diplomatic track hasn't completely collapsed, even amid all this military escalation. Oman's tentative proposal for managing strait traffic, drafted just before Iranian drones reportedly struck sites inside Omani territory, suggests regional mediators haven't given up on finding a framework that could de-escalate this specific flashpoint, even if the broader US-Iran relationship remains deeply hostile. American officials have previously stated that broader negotiations, including talks touching on Iran's nuclear program, cannot meaningfully progress until the security of the strait itself is resolved. That creates a fairly direct, if difficult, roadmap. Until both sides can agree on basic facts and behavior around commercial shipping safety in this corridor, the deeper diplomatic track guaranteeing any kind of lasting ceasefire is likely to remain stalled. And with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the United Nations all now publicly pushing for de-escalation simultaneously, the diplomatic pressure on both Washington and Tehran to find some kind of stabilizing arrangement is mounting fast, even as the military exchanges themselves continue to intensify night after night. So where does all of this leave us? 3 rounds of American strikes in a single week, more than 300 combined targets hit according to CENTCOM's own figures. A disputed claim over whether the world's most critical oil corridor is open or closed, with independent monitoring currently backing the American position that traffic continues to flow, even as the threat level in those waters is officially classified as severe. Iranian retaliatory strikes now reaching at least 5 countries beyond Iran itself, drawing formal condemnation from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the United Nations Secretary General, and a fragile diplomatic track built around Oman's proposed framework for managing the strait that's now being tested by the exact kind of attack, drone strikes inside Omani territory itself, that it was designed to prevent. This is a conflict that keeps finding new ways to widen its own footprint, pulling in more countries, more shipping routes, and more diplomatic institutions with each passing night. Let's talk about the economic dimension of this specific threat, because Iran's decision to publicly claim a strait closure, whether or not it's fully accurate on the water, is itself a form of economic warfare. Even a disputed closure claim tends to spike insurance premiums for vessels transiting the corridor, since shipping insurers price risk based on stated threats and actual attacks, not just verified outcomes. Every attack on a commercial vessel, like the Cyprus-flagged ship or the second vessel Iran claims to have stopped, adds to that risk premium, regardless of whether the strait technically remains passable. That means global energy markets and shipping costs are likely absorbing real financial impact from this crisis, even in scenarios where UKMTO's assessment that traffic continues flowing through the southern route turns out to be the more accurate picture. This is one of the reasons Iran's public messaging around closure matters just as much as the physical reality on the water. In modern energy markets, a credible threat to a choke point like Hormuz can move prices and insurance costs almost as effectively as an actual sustained blockade. It's also worth understanding that this isn't the first time in recent history Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, though the current situation represents one of the most serious escalations of that threat in years. Iranian officials and the IRGC have periodically raised the possibility of closing the strait during previous periods of heightened tension with the United States and its allies, generally as a form of deterrent messaging rather than a sustained physical operation. What makes this week's escalation different is the combination of factors happening simultaneously: an actual attack disabling a commercial vessel with a missing crew member, a second vessel targeted, a formal closure declaration, and 3 consecutive nights of direct American military strikes in response. Previous closure threats rarely came bundled with this level of simultaneous, verified military action on both sides. That combination is a large part of why this particular moment has drawn condemnation from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the United Nations, all within the same 48 hours, rather than being treated as another round of familiar rhetorical brinkmanship. Before we close this out, it's worth being transparent about where the verified facts in this video actually come from, given how contested some of the core claims are. The figures on strike counts, roughly 140 targets in this third wave and more than 300 across the week, come directly from official CENTCOM statements. The disputed closure claim and the counter-evidence around continued shipping traffic come from a combination of Iranian state statements, U.S. Central Command's own public position, and UKMTO's independent monitoring data, all of which have been reported and cross-checked by CNN, NPR, The Washington Post, and Gulf News. The retaliatory strikes on Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain are sourced to Iranian state broadcaster IRIBIS and Iran's own military statements, corroborated by confirmed intercepts reported by Kuwait's armed forces, Qatar's Ministry of Defense, and the UAE. Where a claim comes from only one side, like the specific details of the unauthorized route the IRGC cited for attacking the Cyprus-flagged vessel, we've flagged that as unverified rather than presenting it as confirmed fact. Given how fast this story is moving, with 3 separate strike waves in a single week, it's worth checking for updates before treating any specific casualty or strike count as final. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we wrap up, because it explains why so many countries with no direct stake in the original US-Iran dispute are now reacting so forcefully. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman all share one thing in common. Their economies, and in several cases their entire national budgets, are deeply tied to stable energy exports moving reliably through this exact stretch of water. When Iran claims to shut the strait or attacks vessels transiting it, it isn't just threatening the United States or global oil consumers thousands of miles away. It's directly threatening the economic stability of its own immediate neighbors, several of whom have spent years trying to stay diplomatically balanced between Washington and Tehran rather than picking a side outright. That balancing act gets dramatically harder when Iranian drones are landing inside your own airspace, or when your Ministry of Defense has to publicly confirm intercepting a missile aimed at your own territory. The strength and speed of this week's condemnations, from Riyadh, from the Gulf Cooperation Council, from the United Nations, reflects just how directly this crisis now threatens the economic foundations of an entire region, not just the 2 countries formerly trading strikes. That regional exposure is also why the Oman brokered proposal for managing strait traffic matters more than it might initially seem. It's not just a diplomatic gesture between 2 governments. It's an attempt to protect the economic lifeline of nearly every country bordering the Gulf, at a moment when a single attacked container ship has already triggered 3 rounds of military strikes and pulled 5 additional nations into active retaliation within a single week. Whether that proposal survives contact with the reality of drones striking Omani territory less than a day after it was drafted is one of the clearest signals to watch for in the days ahead. If Oman's mediation effort collapses entirely, it would suggest this crisis has moved beyond the point where regional diplomacy alone can contain it. If it somehow holds, even loosely, it may be the only thing standing between the current severe threat level in the strait and a genuine, sustained disruption to global energy markets. Let's go back to where we started. 1 Cyprus-flagged container ship, 1 missing crew member, One disputed declaration that the world's most important oil route had been shut down entirely. Within hours, that single incident produced the third round of American strikes in a single week, roughly 140 targets hit overnight, bringing the week's total past 300. And within hours of that, missiles and drones were flying toward Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, with Oman itself getting pulled into the crossfire less than a day after hosting talks meant to prevent exactly this outcome. The Strait of Hormuz, according to the people who actually track ship movements independently, remains open right now, but open doesn't mean safe, and safe is looking further away with every single night this exchange continues. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what's true and what's disputed in this latest escalation, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what stood out most. Whether it's the open versus closed dispute over the strait itself, the strikes reaching 5 different countries, or Oman getting hit just a day after hosting peace talks. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this crisis as it develops, because based on the pace of the last 7 days, round 4 is very likely already on the way.